Folks who are just joining us, welcome to our next entry in our Pro People Lawyering series. We are super excited to be joined by Leah Goodridge, New York City Planning Commissioner, housing attorney, does all kinds of amazing work. And we are going to just let people kind of make their way in for the next minute, something like that. And then we'll kind of get this kicked off. And I guess like while we're waiting for people to make their way in, I'm just going to give a little overview of what this series looks like. Basically, at People's Parity Project, we are very much focused on how do we take the legal system, make it actually serve the people, as opposed to powerful entities like corporations, the state, things like that. We want a legal system that actually is serving all of us, right? Not the people who are in positions of power. So the legal system, law schools, all of this tends to funnel us towards all of those more pro-corporate, pro-carceral, other types of jobs. And we're trying to highlight people we see doing really awesome work, actually working for the people. So that's what this series is about. At the end, we will talk a little bit about how you can get involved in the work that we do. Over the course of the talk, Leah will talk a little bit about just like different ways that we can get involved in some of the work that she does, things like that. So we can kind of try and move people towards, again, actually working for the people. So I think we can kick it off here. So I am so glad to introduce Leah Goodridge. I'm going to let you kind of give your own introduction on like your background, how you got here, that kind of thing. But we're just so excited to have you with us. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to just throw the first question right at you. So could you introduce yourself and just let us know what kind of brought you to your current position where you're at now?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I am Leah. I spent 12 years as a tenants' rights attorney, and that means that I worked at 3 different local New York City nonprofits, and I represented low-income tenants who were facing eviction. And for the last 3 years, I have been a commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission. That does not require a law degree, but it has been helpful having the background of a tenants' rights attorney to be able to speak up on issues that really pertain to housing. It's zoning and land use, but housing is a big chunk of it. So that's my background. It's basically a social justice background with a sprinkle of government, boards.
Nice. And on I don't know, a little curveball, I guess, but just like on the board, like, so we get a little bit of your background. Is that typical on the planning commission, or do you find yourself kind of like out there a little bit, or just like what does that kind of look like?
So I was, according to the DCP, which is the agency connected to the Planning Commission, I was the first tenants' rights legal aid attorney appointed to the commission. So it's not typical. My background is not typical. It sounds strange, but urban planning and housing are 2 very different fields. And so there are lots of people who are, they have their training and their experience in urban planning, meaning they worked for a city planning department somewhere, or some other sort of advocacy group, and it's very much about zoning reform. And then apart from that, there are tenant organizers, there are tenants' rights attorneys who are specifically working regarding issues of the rent and housing affordability. And so the 2, even though they're related, they don't necessarily mix as often as they should. And so you will find on planning commissions, I would say the majority of the people are, yeah, like I said, overwhelmingly, there's not a lot of like housing people per se. There are a lot of, and when I say housing, I mean tenants' rights. So housing is such a broad area. There's developer housing, which I obviously I'm not a part of. There is landlord housing. So you do have some housing folks, but when I say housing, I specifically mean tenants' rights, local grassroots housing. So there's not a lot of that on most planning commissions across the country. It is not very common. I will say it is mostly, local zoning, reform background.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It kind of fits with kind of what we've seen. And I guess like what I would say to everybody else, just like you should be pushing for more people like Leah on your planning commissions. But because yeah, I think having that kind of perspective is really important. I think it's way too often left out, right?
And I think people might ask, well, what difference will it make? Because I know I definitely roll my eyes when people say like infiltrate and agitate, like be part of the system to change it. And we know how hard that can be, especially in institutions that are not meant to change and they don't want to. But when we're talking about the Rent Guidelines Board, for example, which I was on, or the City Planning Commission, these are bodies of government where people are voting on a measure. And so the majority of the vote means that it'll pass or it won't pass. So if you have an overwhelming majority of people who come from a certain background, that in fact influences how the votes play out. And in turn, it influences the housing policy and the zoning policy of one of the largest cities in the world.
mhm. Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. Um, so I guess like on that, could you just describe for us what are some of the main issues that are facing renters and how have you worked to address some of those issues, both as a housing attorney and now as a planning commissioner?
I would say the main issue facing renters is housing affordability.
Mhm,
And, that sounds, everyone knows that, but let me break down some things that some people may not know and bring in the commission part. There are many proposals that come before the commission, and they're housing proposals and they will include affordable housing. And so I'm like, yay. But what I've learned to do is stop and wait to see how much this affordable housing is going to be. Because
mhm,
then when I do that, sometimes the income eligibility starts at $60,000. And it could go all the way up to six figures. And I'm talking about for one person. I'm not talking about for a family of two or three. And
mhm,
so oftentimes the actual measures to solve the housing crisis, which would be provide affordable housing, are not enough. And this is what I call sometimes fake affordable housing, because the clients that I represented, the Uber drivers, the home healthcare workers, all of these folks who make, $40,000 or less. Imagine if affordable housing starts at $40,000, they're not eligible for this. And
mhm,
so they're also not going to get public housing, which is the New York City Housing Authority, because the wait list for that can go on for 10 years. The Section 8 wait list was closed for 15 years, recently opened up and was only open for a small bit. But you get the picture. It's very hard to find something that's affordable. The
mhm,
other the other aspect to this is when you go on foot and you try to find a rent stabilized apartment, because that makes a lot of sense. Let me get a rent stabilized apartment. There's a barrier that you're going to face. And that one barrier is called a broker. Most of the apartments that New Yorkers come across have a broker that has been hired by the landlord. And right now, brokers are charging, many of them are charging 15% of the annual rent for a rent stabilized
mhm,
apartment. And when you ask them, why are you charging so much for a rent stabilized apartment? They say, oh, it makes sense in the long term because it's kind of like I found you a co-op, because you're going to pay less rent. So this is why Council Member Chiosei has proposed the Fair Act to create some parity here, which would mean that whoever hires a broker pays the broker. But I'm giving an example of when you actually try to find affordable housing and you find it, and then you come across this unexpected barrier that you can't even access it because the apartment might be affordable, but in order to get it, you have to pay thousands of dollars of this one-time fee that you're not going to get back. This isn't the same as a last month's rent or, security deposit that you might theoretically get back. This is just money that goes into the trash.
mhm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think just like and you've just like lost the affordability, right? Like it
Right.
was, not only do you have to add that 15% just like over your rent, that's a lump sum payment that you're making right up front, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, no, that makes sense. That's rough. So I guess like in consideration of some of those barriers that people do face, one of the things that we've seen is just like a lot of the problems that are facing renters are kind of the products of a legal system that's stacked against them, right? And as a lot of us, most of us in this organization are either lawyers or law students, and you can see a lot of these harms are basically facilitated by lawyers. I mean, on the landlord side, but still. Um, so, what are some of the ways that lawyers can actually be a part of the solution, rather than maintaining the status quo and make sure that people can actually have some sort of housing security and like have roof over their heads?
Well, let me just say one of the things that I have thought about frequently and extensively, and also written about extensively, is just the fact that you can actually work in a social justice organization and it be run like a business. This is part of the issue of the nonprofit industrial complex, where you have places that have a model that's built after a machine. And so you have staff attorneys that are taking on as many cases as possible to meet funder needs. And so that means that in each of those cases, they are turning out the eviction mail. You can't get to all of the issues because you have to move on to the next case. And so that begins to not feel very social justice, right?
Mhm.
Because in each of these cases, there are many issues. One of the main things that clients complain about at many of the, when, they go and they seek attorneys for their eviction case, is that when I go to court, it feels like a mill. It feels like a machine. I'm a number. And unfortunately, they feel betrayed because the same thing happens when they seek help in these organizations. And that's
Mhm.
because of the funding model.
Mhm.
So one of the things that needs to change is the funding structure and the way that nonprofits are run, because let's be real, most of these, if we're talking about pro people lawyering, it's going to be at a we're not talking about like, law firms. There are some public interest law firms, but by and large, we're talking about nonprofits. The structure would be a nonprofit. So I think it's totally possible and very common to have people who are passionate about the work, but because of the structure of the institution, it's actually very difficult to achieve social justice aims. So that's one thing that needs to change and needs to be discussed more. The other thing is, in the legal field, precisely, there is a real thought that we have to keep our emotions out of the work, and that we should be neutral, right? We're taught about this reasonable person. We're taught that in order to be this excellent lawyer, that we have to think of this, imaginary reasonable person and think outside of ourselves and be neutral. And really, in order to be analytical, think out of the issues and take our emotions out of it. And unfortunately, the way that plays out when you work at a social justice organization is that the substance of the work itself, like, for example, that deals with race, gender, all of the social justice issues, is often separated out from the work. So you will actually hear phrases like, um, this is more extracurricular, like talking about the issues, talking about race is sort of like an extra issue. But you will not find attorneys who are putting in their briefs, social justice attorneys who are literally putting in their memos about their clients. This person is facing eviction because of gentrification, or this person is the only Black tenant in their building. Why? Because they might say, well, they don't want to piss off the judge, because most of the judges will ask, why are you mentioning this? Are you bringing a racial justice claim? But that's the manifestation of the work separating out, like it being like, unless you are explicitly bringing a racial justice claim, why are you talking about the overarching social issues pertaining to this case? This is not the law.
Mhm.
So I think one of the things that we can do as lawyers is to really push up against that. So if you end up working at these institutions and you're representing people, it's totally okay to provide the judge, or, you know, if it's the jury, the decision maker, provide them with the story of your client. And it doesn't have to be this sort of rote routine, I'm just following the black letter law. And if this doesn't have anything to do with it, I can't tell this sort of like colorful story. I think that clients appreciate when we do that more. It lets them know that we connect to them, we empathize with them, and we understand the wider story.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And it also makes me think like of the different ways that lawyers can kind of facilitate other work that happens like outside of the courtroom too, right? So like, when you're hired as a lawyer, I mean, obviously you're here to like represent your client, like for the judge, that kind of thing. But there's so much happening. I think like, New York in particular, like just looking at like different like organizing happening among tenants and things like that. We're like, are there ways that like as a lawyer you can kind of incorporate some more of that, or like either kind of assist with the work that like organizers are doing, or scoop some of that up and like bring that into your legal work? Are there some ways you can kind of bring more of that? Because like you said, it's like if you're just operating within like fully within just like law as it exists, it's like you're missing so much context and all of that. Like what are some of the other ways that you can kind of like address that, do you think?
Well, I think one of the mistakes I've seen, one of the first mistakes I've seen lawyers in this area make is it's very easy to do your work as a social justice attorney in a legal services organization and actually never interact with an organizer. You can literally do this for a decade or more and never interact with a tenant organizer. Entirely possible. You just do your cases, go to court, go home. That's it. Um, However, that's one mistake. The second mistake is when lawyers do join coalitions with organizers and then they themselves try to usurp. And then they're like, I
Mm,
want to be the organizer. Listen, it's kind of like saying, I want to be the social worker. It's like you have your role and let organizers do their role, right? You don't have to take over, because sometimes, with lawyers, we're like, we need to be the leaders. So I've been in in these spaces where you have these coalitions, and so you have lawyers, and they're like, I need to talk, I need to be the one to like come up with the plan, and the organizers are like, okay, this is why we don't want to mix, because you know how this might even be the first time that some lawyers are in spaces where it truly is communal. It isn't
mm,
about competition. It isn't about having an adversary. It isn't about beating someone. It isn't about being the one to like have the best point and talk. It is truly a communal space. We're all working towards the same goal. And I think as part of that, it's totally okay to recognize someone else has a strength that I don't. And so they are the organizer. So I'm going to take a back seat and I'm going to let them organize. I'm going to ask them how I can help them, but I don't necessarily need to be the organizer, because we have to understand organizers are leading people. So, you organizers are the ones that tell you what to do. So sometimes your role might not be, hey, I'm going to join with the organizing, but it's the organizer told me I need to go and gather 3 people, or I need to send these emails out to get this group. This is what I'm going to do.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think like that is something that we talk about a lot. We're just like, figuring out what your role is, right? We're like, because I know for us, there's some things we work on where just like you can be the organizer. It's like you're doing something on your law school campus, like great, you're the expert there.
Right.
When you've got somebody who's dealing with like housing insecurity, like in your city or something like that, like they're the experts. They're the ones closest to the problem, the ones closest to the solution. You let them do their thing. And that's not just like, okay, you go do your thing necessarily, but just like like, what do you need from me, right? Uh,
Right.
and you're not, yeah, you can't. I think that is a common problem we do hear about, just like, lawyers entering movement spaces and then trying to take over or something like that. And just like, that's just not our role, right? Um, so yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Um,
I mean, I'll be honest. I learned this the hard way. when I was on the rent guidelines board, as I was I was appointed by by former Mayor de Blasio. I was a tenant member, and I worked alongside tenant organizers. So I was part of an entire coalition, and I was one of like only 2 lawyers, and everyone else was a tenant organizer because I was on the rent guidelines board. Everyone else was a tenant organizer. And so it was very interesting because one of my first meetings, I thought to myself, well, I'm here, I'm in this leadership capacity, I'm a lawyer, so I should be the one speaking up to like share my expertise. And before I could do that, someone else who was like a senior organizer, he sort of, talked a lot, kind of took over the meeting. And afterwards, I happened to, be in a circle with people talking. And then they started talking about how people like take over and people come in with their seniority and take over. And that was a learning lesson for me because I was thinking, oh, I think I was about to make that mistake. But it was interesting to hear how other people perceive it because it isn't necessarily perceived as, oh, this person is being a leader. It is, this person doesn't know how to be in community. We're all
Yeah.
here to talk. We're all here to share ideas. We're not here to like, when we're all here to equally contribute. We're not here to like be led by one person. We're all here as one group. And I think that sometimes that flies over some folks' heads. And I'll be honest and say that I was going to be one of those folks. I was going to be one of those folks. I had to learn to get in the back seat. I think also from my perspective, I thought, well, why wouldn't I, maybe people are expecting me. I don't want, I don't want people to feel like I'm not doing enough. So it's not necessarily nefarious or someone being annoying or performative. These are just thoughts I had, I should be speaking up. And I had to learn, no, sometimes leadership is also being led.
Yeah, totally. That's great. So yeah, I think that those are really important considerations. And so thinking about that, and again, it's like being aware of like what our role can be, but just like what are some of the main like legal impediments to housing justice that you've seen? So I mean, obviously, like there's just so many systemic issues that contribute to this, but just like thinking just legally, like what are the biggest issues that people are kind of running up against, do you think?
I'm sorry. So just to clarify, the main housing issues people are facing
within housing, yeah.
Yeah, number one is eviction, clearly, and that based on not being able to afford the rent. And that in of itself being based on housing affordability. I mean, look, at one point, the Manhattan median rent or the New York City median rent was like $5,000, right? And so that's a lot. I can't afford that. And I'm on the planning commission, right? That's a lot of money. And so, I think that it is vapid and very intellectually lazy to conclude that like, oh, people just don't want to pay their rent. Like, if rent was $200 and people weren't paying it, okay. But rent is $5,000 in Manhattan and thousands of dollars. And on top of that, that doesn't even necessarily mean that apartment is this, spick and span new luxury apartment. A lot of these apartments are broken down and need repairs. So that's one issue. I mentioned the other with difficulty accessing even affordable housing, where you have a broker who plays a barrier. Another third issue is harassment. Harassment comes up in various ways. It could be your landlord or the employees of the landlords who make comments towards you. I have had a lot of clients who they are a marginalized identity, whether it be by race, by sexual identity, and the worker in the building is just making comments. And sometimes they can't quite, it isn't this like, there are enough that it's not this explicit comment, like it's not an explicit racist or homophobic comment, but the treatment and the vibe and the like, would you interact this way if I wasn't this identity? It's there. And I get a lot of clients who describe this, and that is often in conjunction with an eviction case. So
Mm,
it's like they don't like me. And then they're also nitpicking about, because I have a cat, but I've had the cat for however long, and this other neighbor down the hall has a cat and they're not bothering them. So maybe this is also a factor. So that comes up as well. Another way that this comes up is ageism. You know, if there are a lot of
mm,
landlords who want younger tenants, if you are a senior, even if you're on fixed income and that income is dependable because you're getting it every month. I know it sounds like, what, as a landlord, practically speaking, why wouldn't you want a tenant who has guaranteed income? Oh, because some of them are not practical or rational. So they sometimes a reason, okay, they might have fixed income, but they might not be able to keep up with the rent increases, or they might have fixed income, but they also will likely ask for a transfer to a lower floor apartment at some point for reasonable accommodation. And I, as a landlord, don't want to deal with that. This comes up,
mm.
unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I wonder how much of that too is just like, just my experience, when I was renting, it's just like for a landlord, that's your opportunity to like your easiest opportunity to jack up the rent, right? Is when you have a new tenant. So if you're preferring younger people who are, a little more transient, you're more likely to move, whatever, like as opposed to a senior who's maybe going to stay here for 10 years and
Right,
I'm gonna have to fight them every year for like a rent increase or whatever. Like,
right.
but yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, I guess that just goes to like what the system is, right? We're just like all of the incentives for the landlord like just don't work. Like they just go in the opposite direction from like the actual renter, right? Like,
You know, and at the end of the day, housing is a business if it's privatized. So the main priority for folks is, I want my money.
mhm,
It isn't, and I say this as I get, I hear all the stories. There was a lady in California, she's 93 years old facing eviction. She's been in this apartment for 40 something years. New landlord came in. Oh, well, they want money,
mhm,
and so it doesn't register to them. I don't think that this is a good idea. It's going to be hard for her to find an apartment. And also just, it's generally just very difficult for a senior, even who is in their 70s, to move, but 93, that's a lot.
mhm,
But why would someone do that? Because of money. Money, the root of all evil. And I think, for me, I talk about race a lot because it isn't often spoken about in housing justice spaces, probably in large part because it's not as diverse as it should be, but also because of all the things I mentioned when we talk about the law and how it's often separated out and it's just the law. And then the law is supposed to be this race neutral space. But one of the things I have pointed out is oftentimes, because of the legacy of segregation, of slavery, of Jim Crow, you have a wealth gap, a racial wealth gap. And unfortunately, one of the main ways that Black Americans are taught to catch up with this wealth gap. I mean, you guys can probably finish the sentence, but people say, oh, the quickest way to get wealthy is what? Is real estate. And when they're saying real estate, they're not saying, oh, but they're talking about being a landlord. They're talking about being a landlord. And so this comes up when I talk about my tenants' rights work. And I mention all of the things that we all know are happening. Many of us I experienced them. My clients have experienced them. This is not just an aberration. I mean, this is a whole apparatus and a whole system. And I do get folks, many of them whom are people of color, whom are Black, and they're not willing to go quite 100% full throttle into the tenants' rights movement, because they're like, okay, but this is my saving grace. This is my backup plan.
mhm,
This is my plan at some point in the future to like buy property. I see this happen. I see them talking about this on these shows that I watch, or these radio shows or wherever, like people come on their real estate. So, this is my backup plan. So I don't really quite want to go 100% all in on this tenants' rights stuff. And I don't really want to talk too much crap because actually this is something I may want to do because this is how I can catch up. We don't
Mhm.
talk enough about that dynamic, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, just again, it's a systemic issue. It's not gonna think like that, like on the individual level, that's a rational decision, right? That makes sense.
Rational, right?
Um,
Especially if you don't have the family wealth and the background, and then
mhm,
are being told, well, this is the easiest way to become, wealthy. This is the easiest way to make
mhm,
six figures. You read any of these books, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, they're going to tell you real estate. This is the easiest way.
mhm,
Um, so this is, and in a sense, we're talking about Black capitalism, right? This has also been, it isn't just real estate, but this has also been taught as like advancement, empowerment is economic advancement and is making money.
mhm,
It isn't necessary. We're not necessarily talking about it in terms of like, what does liberation look like? Because part of that Black economic advancement is also being apolitical or being anti-leftist, right? We see this play out with sports players, for example. There was a really great book many years ago that was published called $40 Million Slaves. It talked about very wealthy Black athletes. They were millionaires, right? Making a host of money, but they could not speak up about social justice issues. They could not speak up about issues affecting Black people. They had to be apolitical, but they had reached the gold standard because the class, they had their money, right?
mhm,
So I think, this is a larger conversation about what actually does liberation look like if it comes at the expense. You have the money, you have you're the landlord, you're this, but then it comes at the expense of the 93-year-old woman who's facing eviction. It comes at the expense of basically furthering a system of inequity.
mhm. Yeah, so I guess like towards addressing some of these systemic issues, I know that like there's been more talk, like in New York in particular, but I think just like across the country, it's like there's been more talk about just like what does more kind of like public, like investing more in public housing, like social housing, that kind of thing. Like where do you see that kind of going, and how could that like address some of the issues you're talking about?
Yeah, I think I'm a big proponent of investing more in public housing. That's something that should have been done decades ago. Um, I mean, it's a lot I'm pausing because there's just like a lot to unpack. But what's happening in New York City is, that's the federal government. And so they're like, the checks are not coming. So let's figure out another way. How do we privatize this? How do we have private parties who might invest in this? They get something out of it. We get something out of it. And obviously, for me, that's not the ideal solution. Um, I will say that with social housing, I don't think that everyone is aware that there is a little bit of a controversy with social housing. And let me explain the controversy. There is a mindset that means testing. And when I say means testing, I mean that housing that is tied to income, meaning that it goes off of who is low income. And if you're above this threshold, you're not eligible for that housing. So that's means testing. There is a mindset that means testing causes resentment by middle class people. I just had I'm active on Twitter at Leah from Brooklyn. I just had someone, I was talking about low income housing, and I just had someone say, oh, well, I'm middle class and so I wouldn't be able to get that housing. And so what about the firefighters? What about the teachers? There's a lot of this. And you have a lot of folks. Let me just make this plain. In doing this work, sometimes the most classist people that I have encountered are not actually people who are incredible uber wealthy. These are people who are low middle income or middle income against low income.
Mhm,
They're right there. And they say the most classist things. Oh, you represent this. I went to the grocery store and I saw someone pull out their EBT card to buy a steak. So
mhm,
I saw someone claiming that they get cash assistance, but their nails were done. So
mhm.
But the people who say this, again, yeah, of course you have ultra wealth. I'm not saying that they don't hate poor people, but what I'm saying is, it is often people who are literally one day away or one life incident away from being in the same boat, who
Mhm,
are the most critical. And so when we're talking about public housing and social housing, the controversy that has come up is, why are we not investing in public housing? Is it because of this sentiment that we just don't, this causes too much resentment to just invest for low income people, that we need housing to be for everyone? We need this universal social housing for all incomes, for moderate income too.
mhm,
And also public housing has historic, well, not for all of its history, but at least for the last few decades has historically been tied to Black and brown people. A higher demographic of Black and brown people, and social housing doesn't have that attachment. It's seen as just for everyone. So one of the controversies that some advocates have brought up is like, is this what, why haven't we had the cachet and the movement to force the government to invest, and other parties to invest in public housing? Oh, so now we want to invest in social housing that wouldn't just be for the low income people who need it the most. It's for everyone. Why suddenly is everyone on board with that, but not this?
mhm. Yeah, well, and that's like, it's interesting as you're talking, I'm just thinking of just like, that's kind of been the strategy all along, right? Like from the founding, where like you take the people who are like, lower down and just pit them against each other. Thinking just like back, it's like the 1700s, you have like the actual people who are running things turning whatever enslaved people and freed black people against, and like having like trying to turn like the Irish against them or whatever it is, like people who like they're all trying to keep down. Just like, don't worry about us up here. Like, look at that person who like is not as deserving, who is getting something that
Deserving
like
for.
you don't have or whatever, like.
Yeah. And I'll say, just to be transparent here, my feelings on this are still they're nuanced and they're inchoate, like they're not complete.
Mm-hmm,
Um I'm still parsing through my feelings about it, and the reason why I'm still at a crossroads is because being on the planning commission, I do get to see when we have this affordable housing and the majority of it is for moderate income people. And so
mm-hmm,
I'm like, what is this? Like, it's now we have this kind of what people would want, this more universal and broader definition of affordability, but now low income people are being pushed out and they're the ones who need housing the most. So what exactly are we doing here? So I feel that's what gives me pause, because if you really jump back and think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Like, of course we want universal like affordability, of course we want social housing, we want everyone to be able to have it makes a lot of sense. But I guess what's giving me pause is I'm getting to see how one small angle of this is playing out, and how as a result of that, even in that small little example, low income people, the most economically vulnerable people, get sliced out.
mm-hmm,
Because, just to put some context to this, it is more financially feasible for developers to offer the housing to the highest income of the low income housing people. It is way more economically feasible. So, again, then you have profit over people and it driving even the lowest income out.
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, that's a lot. Um, so I'm just watching the time. I just want we're gonna just shift gears a little bit here. Um, so do you have any advice for law students or who looking to go into the field, or like lawyers who are looking to make a career change, about how they might be able to get involved in like housing law, like on kind of like renter side? Like, what are the skills that they kind of like most need, and like where do you think they should be kind of like focusing their efforts?
Um, I have a story. It's it's funny that you asked me this, because I did not grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth. I grew up in Brownsville, and with for the most part of my childhood with a single mother. And I grew up in a Mitchellama. And so I, you know, and you know, if people don't know about Brownsville, let's just say my nighttime lullabies were gunshots. Like it was a very common, and especially in the 90s. I was born in 1982. So growing up, you know, this was a very common thing to hear at night. And despite all of that, when I went to school, went to law school, um, it took me failing the bar, failing the bar multiple times, and then having my own housing instability, dealing with my own mental health struggles, um, for me to actually be really prepared to be this fighter and do this work. Because before then, even though I grew up in Brownsville, like I was always this, you know, well, not always, but for the most part, I was a straight A student. So
Mhm.
at, you know, A plus, you know, 1 + 2 is 3, like everything always worked out in terms of school. So I hadn't really experienced failure.
Mm,
I had some mental health issues, but not, you know, not severe. So
mhm,
it is, and I say that because there's so many people who enter this work, and just because you're from a low income neighborhood or from a low moderate income neighborhood, it doesn't necessarily mean even that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to connect to the work. Um,
mm, mhm,
I have met so many people like me, but who didn't have that experience, who came to this work, and then the judgment was there. This is how the judgment plays out. I'm representing this client in their eviction case. All they have to do is walk 5 blocks to go and apply for rental assistance. I've been telling them to do this. It's been 2 weeks. They haven't done it. They have a 2-year-old. Why can't they do this? This is why they're facing eviction. They don't know. They don't know about responsibility. And so all they have to do is walk 5 blocks. Now, I can listen to that story and say, this person is probably facing depression.
mhm,
Person probably has a mental health issue. But someone else who's listening to it, all they are seeing is, I'm telling them to do something, they can't do it. This is frustrating to me. And so I might not even want them as a client anymore.
mhm,
So because I didn't learn this part in law school, right? I already had the empathy, but the part to really be able to assess and go, I'm going to need to get a social worker on here,
mm,
or let me talk to this person the way I would have wanted someone to talk to me. Because I have to say, when you're going through a very rough moment, the last thing you want is someone putting in the fire, like, you got to do this or you're going to face eviction. All that happens is just the person shuts down, right?
mhm,
So let me get a social worker. Let me get some. I would not have, I would not, if I didn't go through my own experiences to know this is what it feels like to not have a support system. This is
mhm,
what it feels like when you do not have a family support system, when you feel alone, when you are feeling the weight of like, I'm in a corner by myself and this is overwhelming. This is what it feels like. If I didn't go through that, I don't think that I would have been the lawyer that I am. And I'm not telling people to, I'm not romanticizing struggle, but what I am saying is, don't rely, if you are from like my background, don't rely on, just because you see these organizations and they're mostly white and middle class, don't make the mistake of going, well, I'm Latina and I'm from the Bronx, so I'm going to get it. No, no. Sometimes you might be the most judgmental person at, you know, or you might, why can't these people get, you know, or it might be a lot of projection. So I think it is really important, in order to truly be a ferocious lawyer, I think it is really important to do a lot of reading into the structure, the
mm,
structural systems, to fully understand and to see how it's going to play out in your cases. Because it is not, there's also another element too. Sometimes when you identify with the clients and you see that they're about to, face eviction or something because of something that seems beyond your control, that you're telling them to do something and they won't. There's another aspect of it too. People get anxious. The lawyer sometimes can get anxious and go, I just want you to do, like, why can't they do? And then all the projection starts.
Mm,
And I want us to understand that that's also part of being not a great lawyer, because you have to take a step back and go, I think this person has some issues that are beyond my skill set, and I'm going to need some
mm,
help with that.
mm. Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. I think that's like such an important thing that like you said, you don't learn law school, right? Like it's just like um have if you're actually going to serve like the people that you're working with, like that has to be holistic to some extent. And there will be some things that you can't do yourself. I think that's really, really great. And one thing I also just want to like raise up too, just like I appreciate you sharing your own story. I mean, like like I'm somebody who's like I've dealt a lot with like PTSD and depression. And, like that has really informed like the way that I approach law school, approach the, like law now, things like that. It takes you to different places. But I think, so often within this profession, that's all like hidden away, like, no, 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 I'm totally fine. I can just grind through this and whatever. But, you know, so many people are dealing with stuff like this. So it's just like, yeah, so yeah, I just appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I think, you know, this also helped me because I know for me, when I went through one of the toughest life experiences, one of the things that was a real trigger for me was how people spoke to me. And sometimes, sometimes they were jerks, sometimes they weren't, but how people spoke and how I heard it
mhm,
was a real trigger for me. And so there's so many times when I had clients and because we have to remember, these are vulnerable moments. They're sharing their vulnerable moment of facing eviction.
mhm,
And we might have this moment, and then the client thinks I was coming at them or something. And, if it's Leah outside of work, or even if it's Leah and another coworker, I might go, excuse, like, what is that? Like, yeah, I might like go to bat with them. Like, okay, what do you, this is not how it was meant. And if that's how you took it, with the client, because I know, because I've been there, I go, okay, let me back up. I don't know how you took this, but I just want to let you know I'm in your corner.
mhm, mhm,
There's so many people that folks are, let me just back up. When you are facing eviction, or even if folks listening to this, you might not choose tenants rights. You might go into like public defender or some other area of law. But the point is, your client is at a period in their life where they are mostly alone. And you also have to sit back and assess, they're alone, because sometimes they will tell you, this person is not there for me, my family is not, my parents, whoever, right? And so now you're here in this capacity to help them. And they might have had experiences where people who were supposed to be there for them let them down.
mhm,
People who were supposed to be there for them caused their mental health issue, whatever it is, right? And so something like a small interaction between you and a client, and then they hear something and then they start getting like testy. For me, because I've been there, I'm like, oh, no, 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 let me de-escalate this. So
mhm,
I always say, okay, I'm sorry. I don't know how you heard this, but let me just say, I'm in your corner and I'm here to fight for you. And 100% of the time, the client is like, oh, okay. Because they've been to these HRA offices, they've been to these government offices, and people are nasty to them. People are supposed to
mhm,
help them, and instead they're, being that show Martin, the Martin
mhm.
Lawrence show,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
he was like the police, and he was playing all these like the cop roles and the like power trip. There's a lot of those people who are in these positions that are not necessarily the most powerful, but they get to power trip and they get away with it because they're vulnerable people, right? They get to the security guard, they get to do all this stuff. So my clients have had that many times over. And so when it comes to me and I'm the lawyer, I already know I'm the lawyer. There's no reason for me to put them in check or tell them fix their attitude or how they spoke to me. I
Mhm.
just say, I'm in your corner. I don't know how this came out or how you're hearing it, but let me just say I'm in your corner. And 100% of the time they stop and they're like, oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, that's really great. That's good to so for my last question, just do you have any like closing thoughts for attendees or advice, anything like that that we can kind of leave folks with before we head out today?
Um, my advice is that the best lawyers I know have a fighting spirit. So if you are one of these people that you find yourself and you're questioning, like, I don't really fit in because everywhere I go, I'm, I'm questioning, and this organization didn't want me, and I was bossing up with this, or not bossing out, but I was like challenging this. Guess what? You're gonna be a good lawyer. Um, the best lawyers I know are the real brawlers.
Mm,
They are the real fighting spirit. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're the loudest person in the room. It just means that you have a real like fighting spirit.
mhm,
And so again, that could look like you didn't pass the bar the first time. I'll take this shit 10,000 times if I need to pass. That's how I was. I was like,
mhm,
I'll beat JFK if I need to pass. Like, there is no giving up. I might take a year off, but I will take this again. Like, that's a fighting spirit, right?
mhm,
Um, so I think for me, yeah, having a fighting spirit goes a long way as an attorney.
mhm,
Um, the other piece of advice I'll give is define your voice. A big part of being not just a confident person, but a confident attorney is being a storyteller. So practice like telling people stories. I'm active on social media, and a big part of why I think, at least, I have a large following is that I'm good at telling a story. I'm
mhm,
good at telling my own story, the tenant story, and that's because I've been doing it for a really long time. So, this is what's going on in the housing movement. This is what happened to this tenant in California. This is what happened to me at work. It's really good to be able to, frame the narrative and tell a story to catch people. And it's just a good skill set, even not even as a lawyer, but sometimes even when you go into I do business, and just being able to like do a short 30-second pitch is priceless. It's
mhm,
also good. Sometimes I write a lot of op-eds. I mean, it just goes a long way, being able to tell a story.
mhm. Yeah, no, I love that.
The last thing I will leave you with is I always, I always say this because not everyone comes from like this perfect family where they have like supportive parents and a whole community. I did not. And it's okay. There are a lot of folks secretly who have been through this. And I say this because I was just on a group chat with some law school friends of mine. And I didn't even know, like, one of my law school friends, he was saying, he was like, my mom didn't come to my graduation. So many people have gone through this where you have these great achievements and you don't have the support system
Mhm,
necessarily. And I just wanted, and a part of feeling isolated about that is feeling like it's just you, or that like so many people have this support system that I don't have. No, there are a lot of people who have also been through this. And I just want to let you know that it's way more common than you think, unfortunately. But the second part is build your own community, build your own community. It is really important to have folks who push you, and have folks who are in your corner. And those are folks that you can find.
mhm. Yeah, no, I think it's like finding your people is like so important.
Yeah.
That's what I love about PvP, personally. But yeah, I think that's so important. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. Um, but yeah, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Are
I
there any
think
questions? Does anyone have any career questions?
let's pop up. Oh, we got one question in the Q&A before we close. So let's see. Can you share any insight you have on why or if an extended notice requirement is helpful to tenants? Knowing that apartment associations are currently attacking longer notice periods, how would you respond to policymakers to try to advocate for longer notice requirements?
Well, the notice require a no, so basically a notice is we're going to sue you if you don't do X, or we're prepared to sue you, this is why. And the longer notice period allows a tenant to prepare. So what tenants do is as soon as they get that legal notice, they run and try to find an attorney. So the shorter the period, it means the quicker you're in court. And that also means the quicker, an eviction case is.
Mhm.
So a longer notice period is going to be helpful to tenants because it allows them time. Sometimes it's also like if it's a non-pay and they owe certain rent, and the notice could be like, this is how much rent you owe. If you don't pay this, we're going to start the case. They could also just go find the money and pay it, and they could avoid litigation entirely. So it is helpful.
Mhm. Nice.
Mhm.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, here we go. Just nice comment. I just want to say, as a brand new eviction defense attorney, got my bar number on Tuesday. Congratulations, Charlie.
Oh,
This was so helpful and motivating. Thank you, Leah.
is everyone from New York or everyone's just spread out?
We're all over the place.
Oh, right.
So Charlie, right now, I know is in Colorado. We got people all over. So I'm a new housing law grad at a nonprofit in NYC. So here you go, you guys are your person. This talk was wonderful. Thank you so much. I've been learning a lot in my first month about how to do the job, about housing law, housing court, etc., and not a lot about the structural causes and solutions. So can you speak to how I can advocate for more of that discussion in my workplace?
Okay, here's something that I want to tell you, and you know what? I want you to listen very carefully to me. It's unpopular advice, but do not unwittingly play HR in your workplace. What that means is, especially if you are a new attorney, do not waste time doing these committees and workshops, meaning like, you're basically doing the work that HR should do. You're helping a company or a nonprofit do its program operations, right? Um, don't waste time with that. They are 100% a waste of time. They bring in certain personality types, and instead of training to be the best lawyer, you get into these fights, especially if you are a person of color. It just is not worth it. And I say that as someone who has wasted a lot of time. I was even chair of a lot of these committees. And then when I think back on it, this is really work that this is not my job to come and better a nonprofit. My job is to do the work, not to like do all this HR, like, here's how you can be a better nonprofit. And now I'm going to spend like 5 hours a week. Like, no. So that's number one. If I were to talk to my younger self, honestly, and this is the other unpopular opinion, what I would do is I would focus on myself, and then, meaning I would learn the stuff myself, and then I would do things like I would either write about it, like I did. I wrote a law review article on the issues, or I would give presentations about it. I would make it a part of my career. But do not do this kind of shadow work. And when I say, do you hear all this racket? I have these parakeets and they're like going
Oh,
crazy right now. Okay, good. Uh, so do not do this sort of like, now I'm going to be part of the committee, because again, none of that, it's kind of a time suck. Most of the times it's like, oh, here's a report at the end, and then the ED or whoever doesn't really, what do they do? Nothing. So make it a part of your career. Be strategic and literally make it a part of your career. Ask that institution to give you a little bit of time, so that give you a couple of less cases so that you could write this law review article. Go approach the Practicing Law Institute, ask them if you can give a CLE on said topic. Give another, give CLEs on it. And I know you're like, I'm not an expert, neither was I, but I talked about it and all this stuff that I was going to do, and I was going to waste time doing as part of committees to like round the herd up that people don't listen. The other thing is like, some of these people, let me just keep it all the way real. If you live in New York City, regardless of if you're, especially if you are white and you've lived in New York City for like 10 years and you work in the nonprofit industry for the same amount of time and you still need basic DEI training, you don't want to learn. Okay. You don't want to learn. So that's why I say don't waste your time. Sometimes it's like you're trying to train and change people who don't want to change. Some people just want a 9-to-5 job and to have their like very exclusive, you know what it is, like we got y'all from Insecure, you know what it is. So don't waste time. Focus on yourself. And you can also try to change people, but think of it as doing it beyond just your institution, but think of it as in the legal field. So you can go to the Bar Association, ask them, can I give a presentation here? Have people come, but think about it as I am not going to waste my time trying to be HR and change my colleagues who probably don't want to change. I'm going to try to change the legal field by putting my ideas out there. Go reach out to the American Bar Association Journal and ask them if you can publish an op-ed, which they do have. It is actually very easy to do. Write an op-ed, Teen Vogue, wherever these places, it's so easy to write op-eds. But basically put your ideas out into the world instead of wasting time doing these like little subcommittees, which are just a bunch of performative people. Look, I know some of you guys, if you guys are new, then you don't have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you guys have been doing this for 5 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All of these performative people, the ED doesn't really take the recommendations. It's the same way the next year and rinse and repeat. Don't do this.
Yeah, well, I think that makes sense. And also just like, I would just throw this out there as well. If you are thinking of doing, op-ed work, things like that, that is something that we can support with at PPP. We love when our members write op-eds and we can give you editing, ghostwriting, whatever it is. Like there's all kinds of stuff that we can do to help you out there. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know. I'm going to take one more question because we are kind of like past time here, but real quickly though, for our law students, what are some of the courses that might be kind of like beneficial to take and focus on in law school if this is a field you're interested in?
My best courses that prepared me were critical race studies and critical race theory because I learned about the structural discrimination part. I even, it's so funny. I hated property. You would think as a tenants rights attorney, my favorite class, but I hated property with a passion. I almost dropped out of law school because I hated property so much. The best classes, and I'm biased because I went to UCLA Law School and my professor and mentor was Kimberly Crenshaw. So I kind of had it, I had it all. But critical race theory, especially Crenshaw, she taught it, and Devin Carbato, I had like the most amazing minds. And some of those lessons are things that I've never learned anywhere else. You just won't learn it at any other point at all, even in college. So I would highly recommend taking those types of classes. They are extremely beneficial. It's, they're going through like the legal doctrine and they're going through case law. I had no idea that there were cases until those classes, that there were cases where people of color, Mexican, Indian, were literally went to court to be deemed white because they did not want to be affected by segregation, which, is a huge part of racism. Like they're just doing what they can, but it painted such a picture of why you have in this country like anti-Blackness, and then you even have people of color. Like it took a social conversation and gave it like legal history and background, and it was so important for me.
That's awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Leah. This was great. I think this was like, just added so much to this series, to our members who were able to be here, and we're just so grateful to have you with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
All right, and for everyone else, I'm just real quickly, if you are into this and you want to get more involved with PPP, I'm just dropping our join link in the chat. That'll get you onto our mailing list. There are chapters that we have across the country, whether you are a law student, a lawyer, there are ways that you can get involved. If it's not clear what that looks like, my email I just dropped in the chat, steve@peoplesparity.org. I'm our organizing and network director. So my job is to make, if you're interested in doing this, like my job is to make sure that I can get you connected with something where you can actually live that out. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again, Leah. And we will see you all again soon.
Right.
Okay, take care.